Welcome to the Reflection Chair, a quiet space for heartfelt stories, gentle wisdom, and moments that warm the soul. Sit back, breathe, and let today's story find you. Ethan met Grace on a typical rainy afternoon in Portland, the kind of light but lingering rain that makes everyone hurry to find shelter. Grace stepped into the small coffee shop on the corner of Hawthorne Street, her hair slightly messy, her coat damp, her eyes searching for an empty seat. She looked as if she had jogged an entire stretch of the street, yet still managed to offer a polite smile to anyone who accidentally made eye contact with her. Ethan, the type of person who always carried two umbrellas, one for himself and one just in case someone needs it, as he often said, was already sitting in his usual corner by the window. He noticed Grace fumbling as she wiped the raindrops off her sleeve. Something about her drew his attention. Not because she was overly striking, but because there was a sincerity and simplicity reflected in every small gesture she made. When Grace stepped back outside to call a car and realized her hands were empty because she had forgotten her umbrella, Ethan stood up, walked quickly toward her, and held out his spare umbrella. "You should take this. Portland doesn't go easy on anyone," he said with a half-joking, half-serious tone. Grace laughed, a warm laugh that made the gray weather feel suddenly lighter. "Are you sure? What if I forget to return it?" Ethan shrugged. "Then I hope at the very least you'll come back to give it back." And just like that, they stood together under the small awning, watching the rain fall straight onto the sidewalk as if it were writing the beginning of a new story. No one could have predicted it. But that moment became the starting point for everything that would follow in their lives. When Grace returned to the coffee shop a few days later to return the umbrella, Ethan couldn't hide his surprised smile. Portland was still raining, but the day felt brighter than usual. Grace stood at the counter, absent-mindedly spinning the umbrella in her hand, while Ethan tried to stay calm, even though his heart was pounding like he had just run uphill. They decided to sit down together. Just 10 minutes, as Grace said. But 10 minutes turned into an hour turned into 2. And before they knew it, the little coffee shop had become their weekend meeting spot. The days Ethan and Grace spent together weren't extraordinary, yet it was precisely that simplicity that made them unforgettable. They made coffee together in Ethan's small kitchen. Grace loved extra foam cappuccinos, while Ethan preferred a strong black Americano. Whenever they played music, they inevitably argued about playlists. Ethan loved alternative rock, while Grace leaned towards soft, gentle indie songs. They were different, but it was precisely those differences that created a gentle kind of energy both of them could feel. On Sunday afternoons, they would stroll together around Laurelhurst Park. Grace always bent down to pick up a few oddly shaped leaves to press into her notebook, while Ethan photographed her in the sunlight as if he were afraid of missing even a single moment. Ethan loved the way Grace laughed whenever it rained. "Rain makes everything feel more real," she would say, tugging Ethan's hand as they ran through the sheets of water cascading from the rooftops. To Grace, Portland was most beautiful when it was wet. To Ethan, Portland was most beautiful when Grace was in it. It was a time when just looking at each other felt enough. No need for many words, no need for grand promises. Simply being in each other's presence was already a form of happiness. They believed everything would stay that way, soft, warm, and complete. But life sometimes has its own way of testing the things we cherish most. Everything began to shift in early spring when Grace received an email from New York, a job offer she had dreamed about for years. It was a cultural reporter position at a major publication, the kind of opportunity very few people ever get. Grace opened and reopened the email countless times, as if afraid that if she blinked, the message would disappear. Ethan saw the bright spark in her eyes, but at the same time, something strange stirred inside him. Not because he wasn't happy for her, but because he knew this opportunity would change everything. That evening, they sat on their familiar sofa, with the soft tapping of rain outside, the sound they had once considered the soundtrack of their story. Grace placed her laptop across her lap, turned to Ethan, and said, "I don't know what to do. This is my dream. But what about us?" Ethan stayed silent for a few seconds before giving her a gentle smile. "If this is what you've always wanted, you should go. I don't want to be the reason you miss your chance." Grace rested her head on his shoulder, but the familiar sense of peace no longer felt whole. In the days that followed, they tried to act normal, still having coffee, still walking around the city, still talking about little random things. But a quiet shift had slipped between them, like a tiny crack neither of them wanted to look at directly. Whenever Grace talked about the new job, her eyes lit up. But when Ethan asked about long-term plans, her voice softened and dimmed. One evening, as they walked across the Burnside Bridge, Grace suddenly asked, "Do you think we're really strong enough for a long-distance relationship?" Ethan stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. In her eyes, there was no anger, only fear and love, tangled together. "I want to believe we are," he said, "but I'm not sure." And that sentence, painfully honest, was the first real sign that their journey was about to enter a much harder chapter. Grace moved to New York in early June. Portland that day was drizzled with the lightest rain, as if saying goodbye with quiet sorrow. Ethan drove her to the airport, trying to appear composed, though every step felt like it dragged a heavy part of him along. Grace hugged him tightly before stepping into the security line, promising they would find a way to handle the distance. Ethan believed her, or at least he wanted to believe. The first few weeks were fine. They video called every night, sent each other small photos throughout the day, shared silly stories just to feel like they were still together. But then, Grace's new job became busier. Her interview schedule filled up, her meetings grew longer. And Ethan was struggling with a software project reaching its final, intense phase. Their nightly calls slowly became a forced routine. Each evening was just two exhausted people trying to pretend everything was okay. Some nights, Grace said, "I'm so busy today, let's talk quickly, okay?" Some nights, Ethan sighed, "I'm sorry, I'm fixing a bug. I'll call longer tomorrow." The conversations that once excited them now only reminded them of how far apart they really were. Then came the silence. Unread messages, missed calls. The "sorry, I've been so busy" texts appearing more often than the words, "How are you?" One Saturday evening, while Ethan was cooking the meal they used to love, he sent Grace a photo. 2 hours passed, no reply. 4 hours, still nothing. When Grace finally texted back, it was only a single line. "Sorry, I'm on a deadline. That looks really good." Ethan stared at the short message, feeling something inside him slip. Not because she replied late, but because he realized he was no longer a part of Grace's everyday life. When two people in love begin walking in different directions, distance doesn't only live on the map. It lives in the small things they can no longer share. And despite all the effort, they both knew. They were slowly losing each other, even though neither of them wanted that to happen. By late autumn that year, Grace returned to Portland to attend a conference for her newsroom. The city was raining as always, but this time, the rain no longer carried the warmth of the afternoons they once spent together. When Grace texted Ethan that she would be staying for a few days, his heart trembled. Not out of hope, but because he knew this meeting would decide their future. They chose to meet at the cafe where everything began. Ethan arrived early, sitting at the same table by the window. When Grace walked in, her smile was still gentle, but her eyes were heavy with unspoken things. They exchanged small talk, trying to create a comfortable atmosphere. But the invisible distance between them was so large that no cup of coffee could fill it. Finally, Grace set her cup down and looked straight at Ethan. "I feel like we're holding on to something just because we're afraid to let go," she said softly, but clearly. Hearing that, Ethan's chest tightened as if someone had gripped his heart, but he had thought the same for a long time. He took a deep breath and replied, "I know. I still love you. That hasn't changed. But love isn't always enough." Grace nodded, her eyes turning red. "I love you too, but I can't live two lives at once. I can't be in New York chasing my dream and be here with you at the same time." There are moments when the world seems to stand still. The moment they sat in silence looking at each other was exactly that. Ethan reached out and held Grace's hand. "I don't want to be the thing that keeps you from moving forward. If this is the path you choose, I want you to walk it without having to look back." Grace burst into tears, but it wasn't the sound of regret. It was the sound of two people who had loved deeply and who were mature enough to know when it was time to stop. They held each other for a long time. One last embrace, not to cling, but to say goodbye in the kindest way possible. And right where their love began, they chose to end it. Not because the love was gone, but because they had loved enough to let go. After that day, Grace flew back to New York. Portland was still rainy, but the rain felt different to Ethan. It was no longer the gentle soundtrack of walking under eaves together, laughing and holding hands. Now, it felt like a reminder that the most beautiful things sometimes exist only in memory. In the first weeks, Ethan tried to focus on work. He spent more time at the office. When he got home, he immediately opened his laptop. But sometimes, just hearing a song Grace used to love or seeing the umbrellas hanging in their favorite cafe made his chest tighten a little. Not because he regretted anything, but because he missed the things left unsaid. And Grace, though living in the bustle of New York, still had evenings when she sat watching the streetlights reflect against her apartment window. She opened the notebook filled with pressed leaves from Portland, touched the pages lightly, and smiled sadly. "I loved with everything I had," she whispered to herself. "And I let go with all the kindness I could." One winter afternoon, when the city was covered in snow, Grace sent Ethan a photo, a corner of Central Park glowing gold under the lamplight. She wrote, "I'm all right, and I hope you are too." Ethan stared at the message for a long time. There was no bitterness, no regret, only peace. The kind of peace that comes when you know a relationship has fulfilled the role it was meant to play in your life. He replied, "I'm all right. I'm glad you're living the life you chose." And that was enough. Neither of them tried to stay in touch every day, nor did they force themselves to become friends. They simply let their story settle into the place it belonged. A beautiful memory, clean, gentle, and untouched. Life has loves like that, ones that don't lead to marriage, don't have a perfect ending, yet still touch us in ways we remember for years. Ethan and Grace didn't win or lose in this story. They simply learned that there are people we love deeply, but loving them doesn't mean we have to keep them. Letting go is sometimes the most human, the most compassionate way to say we both deserve the kind of happiness meant for us.